Welcome to Sleep with Secrets, where bedtime gets darker and secrets never sleep. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because some stories disappear before they're ever heard again. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? I'd like to know where the secrets are spreading. Now get comfortable and let's get started. Story 1. A blast tore through the sky. Metal screamed, fire bloomed. A passenger plane was falling, spiraling like a dying bird. Over 20 people still inside. When rescuers reached the wreckage, there was nothing but blood, limbs, and scorched debris. One body still strapped to her seat, her face shattered beyond recognition. That woman, Rita Morell, wasn't just a victim. She was a target, and someone close to her had just pulled off Canada's first airborne mass killing. But who planted the bomb? And why did they make sure Rita never left that plane alive? Here's how it all began. On the morning of September 9th, 1949, the skies above Quebec City stretched clear and bright. A gentle autumn sun painted warm shades of amber and gold across the dense forest that lined the banks of the St. Lawrence River. Beneath those colorful leaves, the world seemed quiet and safe, unaware of the tragedy that was only minutes away. Patrick Zenier stood along the river's edge, casting his fishing line into the gently flowing waters. At 35, Patrick found comfort in fishing. It was calm, peaceful, and predictable. His eyes wandered lazily over the landscape, soaking in the colors of early fall, the breeze whispering softly through the trees. These tranquil moments made him appreciate life, simple and untouched by chaos. Then, abruptly, everything changed. A deafening explosion ripped across the sky, shaking the very air around him. Patrick jolted, his heart pounding furiously in his chest, eyes immediately scanning upward. Above, trailing dark smoke, a passenger plane veered wildly, its once steady flight replaced by a desperate struggle against gravity. Flames and twisted metal marked its wounded body, and it tumbled like an injured bird toward the distant hills. Patrick watched helplessly as the plane plunged downward, the echo of the explosion still ringing in his ears. It hit the wooded slope with a gut-wrenching crash, sending echoes across the river and into the surrounding countryside. Dropping his fishing rod, Patrick raced up the steep banks, legs trembling beneath him. He moved swiftly, instinctively, navigating the terrain he knew by heart, desperate to help whoever might have survived. Reaching the hillside, he came to an abrupt halt. There, stretched before him, was devastation. Pieces of metal and fabric were scattered like leaves in the wind, mixed with broken luggage and debris. Patrick's breath caught painfully in his throat. His gaze traveled over the wreckage, hoping to find someone, anyone alive. But he saw only heartbreaking silence. No movement, no signs of life. Stepping carefully through the twisted remnants of the aircraft, Patrick's horror deepened. Human remains lay amongst the wreckage, marking the hillside in scenes of unspeakable tragedy. Fragments of lives cut abruptly short, belongings scattered by the impact, whispered stories of dreams shattered in an instant. Then Patrick noticed something different. A passenger seat, still intact amidst the chaos. His eyes settled upon the seat's occupant, a woman, elegantly dressed, but heartbreakingly still. Her head tilted awkwardly back, her face unrecognizable from the force of impact. One gloved hand clung tightly to the armrest, as if desperately holding on to life itself. Though Patrick could not yet know it, her name was Rita Morell. But Rita was not merely a victim of an awful accident. Unknown to everyone at that moment, Rita had been deliberately targeted, singled out for death by someone close. Someone who, in their dark determination, had willingly sacrificed 22 other innocent lives alongside hers. As emergency services rushed toward the devastating scene, no one yet understood the full extent of what had just occurred. First responders, airline authorities, and families would soon grapple with questions that had no easy answers. How could this happen? What caused the plane to explode? And most hauntingly, who was behind it? In the days to follow, investigators would discover pieces of a puzzle darker and more sinister than anyone could imagine. They would trace the clues back to secrets, betrayal, and a tangled web of relationships that would leave an entire nation shocked. But in that quiet, terrible moment on September 9th, 1949, as Patrick stood frozen, overcome with grief and disbelief, the mystery was only beginning. He had no way of knowing how deeply this tragedy would touch countless lives, how it would mark Canada's history forever. Patrick slowly turned away, haunted by what he had seen, unaware that he had just witnessed the opening scene of a crime so shocking, so incomprehensible, that decades later it would still echo in hushed voices and quiet disbelief. And as the autumn sun continued to shine innocently above, the silence settled once again over the broken remains of Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 108, a silence filled not with peace, but the promise of painful discoveries still ahead. As news of the disaster spread through Quebec City, shock and sorrow filled the streets. Authorities quickly began the difficult work of unraveling the mystery surrounding Canadian Pacific Airlines. Flight 108. On that fateful morning of September 9th, 1949, the plane had left Quebec City Airport at 10:25 a.m. 10 minutes later, it vanished from radar screens, followed swiftly by a catastrophic explosion. Officials initially struggled to understand how such a tragedy could occur so suddenly. An aircraft simply did not explode mid-air without reason. Something was terribly wrong, and the Canadian public demanded answers. Soon after the crash, airline investigator J. Albert Gay, known as Belanger, and his trusted assistant Oliver Bolton were sent to survey the wreckage. With a grim determination, the two men carefully made their way to the isolated hillside known locally as Cap Tourmente. Oliver Bolton was the first to approach the shattered remains of Flight 108, his heart heavy with dread. Stepping carefully, Oliver noted twisted metal shards scattered across the earth, broken propellers twisted into unnatural shapes, and dark stains marking the grass. The smell that lingered in the air turned his stomach, a bitter, unmistakable odor that reminded him of dynamite. Confusion clouded Oliver's mind. He'd expected signs of mechanical failure or a fuel tank rupture, but something felt off. The plane's fuselage remained mostly intact, which seemed strange. If the explosion originated from the aircraft itself, he reasoned, surely it would have torn apart completely. Instead, there were specific targeted damages, a single gaping hole beneath the cockpit, clean and distinct, as if something had burst from within the cargo area. Oliver shared his troubling observations with Belanger, and together the men realized they were no longer dealing with an ordinary investigation. This was no accidental tragedy. It was becoming increasingly clear that someone had intentionally placed something aboard the aircraft, something designed to explode. Within hours, investigators from the Provincial Police, Department of Transport, and Royal Canadian Mounted Police flooded the scene. They painstakingly gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and combed through wreckage. Among the first they spoke to were railway workers who had witnessed the explosion firsthand. One railway worker, still visibly shaken, recounted, "It was directly above us when it happened. First there was a loud noise, like thunder. Then we saw pieces falling from the sky. Metal, luggage, fragments of clothing. It was as if it rained horror down on us." Another worker described the unbearable smell permeating the crash site. "It smelled strongly of dynamite. I've been around explosives before, and I recognized the odor immediately." These eyewitness statements provided crucial details for the investigators. This was not mechanical failure or human error. Someone had deliberately planted a bomb on Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 108. As detectives pieced together the puzzle, their attention turned to the airline's records. The passenger manifest showed 23 people aboard the plane. 19 of them were Canadians, 3 were American businessmen, and 1 passenger stood out among the rest. Rita Morel, the woman who investigators would soon realize was at the very heart of this sinister plot. Careful inspection of the cargo log offered further insight. Among the luggage and personal items recorded was one particularly unusual entry, a mysterious heavy package weighing approximately 25 pounds. It had been checked in under false names: Delphus Bouchard from Saint-Simeon and Alfred Plouffe of Baie-Comeau, names that quickly proved fictitious. The suspicious box had been delivered to the Quebec City airport earlier that morning by a woman who witnesses describe vividly. She wore all black, spoke loudly, and seemed anxious. A baggage clerk remembered distinctly how the woman had insisted a taxi driver carry the box into the airport terminal. Investigators now had a lead, a starting point that could help unravel the mystery. Authorities quickly tracked down the taxi driver who delivered the woman and her box that morning. His name was Paul-Henri Pelletier. When shown a photograph of a local woman known as Marguerite Pitre, Paul-Henri immediately recognized her. "That's her," he confirmed with absolute certainty. With Marguerite identified as the woman who dropped off the suspicious package, detectives now turned their attention to understanding her connection to this crime. What motive could a seemingly ordinary woman have for placing a deadly bomb aboard an airplane? The answer would soon emerge from Marguerite's acquaintances, who painted a disturbing portrait. Neighbors described her as abrasive, always dressed in dark clothes, earning her the nickname Le Corbeau, or the Raven. Known for her booming voice and quick temper, Marguerite was constantly short on money. She was frequently seen with two men, her older brother, Genereux Roost, and a local jeweler named Albert Guay. Albert Guay was a name investigators recognized immediately. He was Rita Morel's husband, the husband of the woman whose death had already begun to appear far from accidental. Airline records soon revealed something deeply suspicious. Rita Morel's flight ticket had been purchased by Albert himself. More troubling still, Albert had insisted on purchasing extra flight insurance, naming himself as the sole beneficiary should Rita perish in an accident. Guay's neighbors confirmed detectives' growing suspicions. They described Albert as a flashy, charming man who openly cheated on his wife, flaunting young mistresses around town. Behind closed doors, he was controlling and jealous, characteristics that painted a grim picture of motive. Further digging revealed an even darker history. Police records documented an alarming incident just months earlier. Albert had confronted a young woman named Juliette Duhamel, a teenage waitress he'd been seeing on a city sidewalk. He threatened violence, desperate for her affection, even resorting to brandishing a firearm in public. This violent jealousy underscored Albert's dangerous temper and willingness to harm those who stood in his way. As detectives continued their investigation, the web of deceit became more tangled. Marguerite Pitre was not just a casual acquaintance. She was closely tied to Albert, so close in fact, she had once provided him with legal help after his earlier arrest. Investigators now had two prime suspects, Albert Guay and Marguerite Pitre, and questions multiplied rapidly. How had Albert convinced Marguerite to transport the deadly package? What roles had others played? And most chillingly, what would drive a man to murder his own wife, and in doing so, sacrifice the lives of 22 innocent people? Even as investigators pieced together these clues, a leak changed everything. Impatient, taxi driver Paul-Henri Pelletier revealed the investigation's progress to a local reporter. On September 15, 1949, the story appeared in the press, alerting the suspects that police were closing in. This leak had severe consequences. Days later, Marguerite was found unconscious, having ingested sleeping pills in an apparent attempt to end her life. Hospitalized and barely alive, Marguerite later confessed to police that Albert had instructed her to claim responsibility for placing the bomb aboard Flight 108. Under interrogation, she finally admitted delivering the deadly package, though she insisted she never knew its true contents. With Marguerite's startling admission, authorities wasted no time. Albert Guay was swiftly arrested, and the true horror behind Flight 108 was about to come fully into the light. Canada was poised to confront one of the most shocking criminal cases in its history, one rooted deeply in betrayal, jealousy, and a ruthless determination to silence one woman forever. But to fully understand the twisted mind of Albert Guay, detectives knew they would have to go deeper into his past, his relationships, and his chilling capacity for violence. And as they delved further, the story that unfolded was darker than anyone had imagined. In the days following Albert Guay's arrest, detectives dove deeper into the twisted web of deception that had destroyed Flight 108. At first glance, Albert appeared a grieving husband shocked by tragedy, yet beneath this sympathetic facade lay hidden motives darker than anyone imagined. Investigators began by carefully examining Albert's relationships, searching for reasons that might have driven him to commit such an unthinkable crime. Their attention quickly settled on Albert's secretive personal life. Despite being married to Rita, Albert had openly maintained relationships with other women, particularly a young waitress named Juliette Duhamel. Detectives located Juliette and gently convinced her to speak with them, hoping she could shed some light on Albert's troubling behavior. Nervous and visibly shaken, Juliette described in quiet detail how Albert had pursued her relentlessly, first charming, then controlling, and finally abusive. When she tried to leave him, Albert became threatening, even violent. Juliette recalled one frightening incident from June 1949. Albert, armed and desperate, had confronted her openly in the streets, threatening harm if she dared leave him. Terrified, Juliette had turned to the police, but Albert managed to escape severe consequences, helped by Marguerite Pitre, who swiftly arranged legal counsel on his behalf. After this incident, Albert's obsession intensified rather than fading away. Juliette tried repeatedly to distance herself, but Albert insisted their relationship was meant to be. During these attempts at reconciliation, Albert promised marriage, even though he remained married to Rita. Authorities understood now that Albert was deeply unhappy in his marriage, yet he feared public embarrassment if he openly divorced Rita. Divorce was viewed harshly in his conservative community, and Albert was obsessed with maintaining his carefully cultivated public image. Killing Rita, investigators reasoned, may have seemed the only solution in his twisted mind. Detectives uncovered even darker details when Juliette described how, in late 1948, Albert rented an apartment for her, just blocks away from his home with Rita. Juliette, isolated from her family, found herself dependent on Albert, trapped in an abusive and controlling situation. Albert often threatened harm if she attempted to leave him again, at one point physically attacking her and preventing her from escaping on a train. Yet, even after these frightening experiences, Juliette admitted she'd continued seeing Albert intermittently, feeling trapped and helpless. Detectives listened sympathetically, disturbed by the depth of Albert's cruelty. Investigators next spoke with Albert's neighbors, who echoed Juliette's disturbing accounts. While he often made public gestures of affection toward Rita, flowers, kisses in the street, Albert openly flaunted his affairs behind her back. Friends and neighbors whispered sadly that Rita seemed to be the last one aware of Albert's betrayals. With each testimony, the image of Albert as a devoted husband shattered completely. Instead, detectives began seeing him clearly, a dangerously possessive, emotionally manipulative man, capable of shocking violence. Meanwhile, authorities worked to confirm Marguerite Pitre's role in Albert's plot. They visited the Quebec City Taxi Company, where driver Paul-Henri Pelletier, who had transported Marguerite and the deadly package, kept meticulous records of his trips. Paul-Henri reaffirmed to investigators that Marguerite had indeed hired him, seeming anxious and hurried that morning. He vividly remembered the heavy box marked "Fragile," recalling Marguerite's impatience as he carried it into the airport. Police soon located Marguerite's apartment in a modest, rundown neighborhood of Quebec City known as Lower Town. There, neighbors quickly identified her photograph, describing her as loud, abrasive, and frequently short of money, someone who often got herself mixed up in trouble. Neighbors also pointed investigators toward Marguerite's older brother, Genereux Rust, a gifted watchmaker who frequently struggled financially. Both siblings were closely connected with Albert, Marguerite socially, and Genereux professionally. Detectives considered these connections carefully, questioning what roles the siblings might have played in Albert's deadly scheme. As police gathered more evidence, it became clear the bomb had been expertly built with a timer mechanism. Marguerite eventually confessed to police that Albert had asked her to buy dynamite and blasting caps. However, she maintained that she genuinely believed Albert intended to use these explosives for harmless purposes, such as removing tree stumps from a property he claimed to have purchased. Genereux offered a similar story when authorities interrogated him. Calmly, almost indifferently, he described how Albert had requested his assistance building a timed explosive device. Genereux claimed Albert had convinced him the bomb was strictly for clearing trees, and he agreed readily, driven by financial desperation rather than malicious intent. Yet detectives remained skeptical. They struggled to believe that neither Marguerite nor Genereux had understood the true nature of their task. Why would Albert require a timed explosive simply to clear tree stumps? Both siblings must have, at the very least, sensed something deeply wrong. Under continued questioning, Marguerite finally admitted her debt to Albert, a debt of $600 that Albert promised to forgive if she helped him deliver the package. This revelation provided a critical piece of the puzzle. Marguerite had motive enough to overlook any suspicions. Whether through denial or deliberate ignorance, she had delivered a package she knew could potentially harm others. With testimonies and evidence mounting rapidly, prosecutors prepared their case against Albert Guy. Yet Albert himself showed no outward concern, apparently convinced he could manipulate events in his favor, as he had so many times before. But one revelation shattered Albert's confidence entirely. When Juliette Duhamel testified formally before the court, Albert sat listening, confident she would defend him, perhaps even lie for him. Instead, Juliette told the truth, openly stating that she no longer loved Albert, no longer wished to marry him, and wanted only freedom from his control. In that instant, observers saw Albert visibly shaken for the first time. His confidence vanished. His carefully constructed persona crumbled. He suddenly realized the truth. He had committed the worst act imaginable to secure a love that no longer existed. Juliette's public rejection destroyed Albert completely, robbing him of the last thing he believed he controlled. As prosecutors laid out their compelling case against Albert, his financial motives, his controlling relationships, his calculated cruelty, the picture became painfully clear to everyone in court. The crash of Flight 108 had been no tragic accident. It was a meticulously planned crime, driven by jealousy, obsession, and ruthless greed. When the jury returned their verdict, guilty of murder, Albert Gay reacted without surprise or protest. Publicly indifferent to his fate, he declared openly that without Juliette's love, nothing else mattered, not even his life. Yet Albert, still bitter and vengeful, had one final act of cruelty remaining. Before his sentencing, he carefully dictated a detailed confession implicating both Marguerite and Genereux in the crime. He insisted they knew precisely what they were doing, that they willingly helped plan and execute the bombing. The court took Albert's confession seriously. Within months, both siblings were formally charged with murder, their protests of ignorance dismissed. Now, all three conspirators faced justice, a justice the grieving families of Flight 108's victims had desperately awaited. And, as each conspirator awaited sentencing, the entire nation of Canada watched closely, horrified by what had unfolded, mourning the innocent lives lost, and struggling to comprehend how ordinary people could commit such extraordinary cruelty. But even as punishment approached, painful questions lingered. Why had Albert chosen violence over divorce? Why had Marguerite and Genereux willingly aided him? Could greed alone explain such ruthless disregard for human life? Answers to these haunting questions remained elusive, leaving Quebec City and all of Canada forever changed by one of the most shocking crimes in its history. With the trial concluded, the citizens of Quebec awaited sentencing anxiously. Albert Guay had been found guilty beyond doubt, his terrible act of violence forever staining the memories of those who lived through that dreadful September day. Albert sat quietly in his cell, appearing indifferent, unmoved by the judgment. But investigators who studied his behavior closely sensed a hidden bitterness, a rage simmering beneath his composed facade. Although he claimed repeatedly that life without Juliette's love meant nothing, Albert secretly resented how swiftly those he had trusted, Marguerite and Genereux, had turned against him. He resolved to punish them by revealing the truth about their involvement. Sitting alone, Albert carefully dictated a long, detailed confession, implicating the siblings directly. He described exactly how Marguerite knowingly delivered the deadly package, understanding it would explode in midair. He insisted Genereux had knowingly built the explosive device, fully aware it was intended to destroy a plane in flight. Albert spoke calmly, deliberately, determined to ensure he would not bear sole blame. The authorities took Albert's statements seriously, examining them carefully. They soon found sufficient evidence confirming Marguerite and Genereux had knowingly participated in the crime. Even if the siblings claimed ignorance, their actions had undeniably contributed directly to the tragedy. Investigators presented their findings to the prosecution, and soon warrants were issued for their arrest. On June 6, 1950, police officers arrived at Genereux Roust's modest home, taking him into custody without incident. Initially calm and reserved, Genereux continued to claim innocence, insisting he had truly believed Albert's explanations about removing tree stumps. But his protests fell on deaf ears. He had knowingly constructed a sophisticated explosive device, complete with timing mechanisms unnecessary for any innocent task. Marguerite's arrest soon followed. After her earlier hospitalization, she had struggled quietly to rebuild her life, hoping authorities might overlook her involvement. But as the police knocked on her door once again, she seemed resigned, offering little resistance. Investigators brought her in for further questioning, confronting her with Albert's damning confession. Under intense questioning, Marguerite finally broke down, admitting her knowledge about the explosive materials. She acknowledged Albert had promised to clear her debts, making her willing to overlook the true danger of what she delivered. However, she still maintained she never truly realized the full consequences, that Albert would use the device on a plane full of innocent people. Despite their desperate attempts to deflect responsibility, both siblings faced overwhelming evidence. The trials moved swiftly, and the verdicts were quickly returned. Both Marguerite and Genereux were found guilty of murder. The community expressed no surprise. The public, shaken and grieving, demanded justice for the 23 lives lost so tragically. Albert's fate was sealed first. Sentenced to hang, he faced the gallows calmly. On January 12, 1951, Albert Guay was executed, his final words unsettlingly arrogant, even defiant. Standing before the small group of witnesses gathered solemnly, he remarked coldly, "At least I die famous." After Albert's death, Marguerite and Genereux awaited their own executions with quiet resignation. Their trials had left them publicly shamed, permanently linked to Canada's most notorious crime. Both remained outwardly composed, quietly accepting their punishments, though questions lingered regarding their true feelings. Had guilt finally caught up to them, or were they merely accepting consequences they felt unjustly given? On July 25th, 1952, General Ruiz' sentence was carried out. He met his end with little outward emotion, saying almost nothing. His quiet death contrasted sharply with Albert's arrogant defiance, underscoring how different the two men truly were. General appeared more like someone broken by circumstances, quietly regretful of the tragedy he had helped cause but never intended. Marguerite Peach became the last to face her execution. In the months following her trial, Marguerite's demeanor shifted subtly. She became increasingly reflective, turning often to religion, quietly seeking forgiveness. She expressed sorrow openly, but whether genuine remorse or mere self-pity, no one could truly say. On January 9th, 1953, Marguerite walked calmly toward the gallows. Her face showed quiet sorrow, perhaps even regret, but she said little. Her voice soft as she spoke quietly with the priest who accompanied her. Her death marked a somber milestone. Marguerite became the last woman ever executed in Canada. With all three conspirators now executed, the nation breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing justice had finally been served. Yet, even though the legal proceedings concluded, emotional scars remained fresh. Families of Flight 108's victims struggled daily with lingering grief, haunted by the senseless violence that had robbed them of their loved ones. Authorities continued the careful process of rebuilding public trust, reinforcing aviation safety measures, and improving airport security protocols. The disaster had revealed vulnerabilities within Canada's aviation industry, gaps Albert had ruthlessly exploited. Investigators meticulously examined what had allowed Albert's deadly plot to succeed. Airports quickly tightened baggage inspections, adding stricter controls and surveillance systems to ensure similar tragedies never happened again. Canadian Pacific Airlines undertook extensive measures to restore confidence, publicly demonstrating their commitment to passenger safety, yet quietly aware some trust might never fully return. As years passed, Flight 108's tragedy remained etched deeply into Canadian history. Albert's crime became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how jealousy, greed, and obsession could lead ordinary individuals down paths of unimaginable cruelty. For those who lived through the tragedy, the memory lingered painfully. Quebec City remained scarred, its residents quietly aware that beneath their city's peaceful facade, terrible secrets had once thrived unseen. Albert, Marguerite, and Genereux had all hidden in plain sight, their dark intentions masked by smiles, charm, and routine interactions. Even decades later, the names of those involved continued to evoke strong feelings among locals, feelings of sadness, disbelief, anger, and lingering sorrow. Albert's selfish cruelty had robbed the community not only of 23 innocent lives, but also its sense of safety and innocence. Quebec's residents knew firsthand the heartbreaking reality that tragedy could strike suddenly, even on a bright September day, even aboard a trusted airline. And as Canada slowly healed from the wounds inflicted by Flight 108, historians continued to study its terrible legacy. Albert Goy's crime had introduced North America to a shocking new concept: the use of passenger planes as weapons against innocent civilians. His violent act foreshadowed later tragedies worldwide, making Flight 108 a dark, unsettling precedent that would never fade from historical memory. Yet amid the tragedy remained the enduring courage and resilience of those who survived its aftermath: the families, the investigators, and the community itself. In their quiet strength, they honored the memories of loved ones lost aboard Flight 108, determined never to forget the true cost of hatred and betrayal. Thus, while the legal case closed definitively, the story of Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 108 continued on in the hearts and minds of those affected, forever shaping the community they called home. A lasting lesson in human fragility, resilience, and the tragic consequences of unchecked obsession. Still with me? If you're enjoying this and want more, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. I share a new story every night. Your support helps the channel grow and keeps the secrets coming. Now, let's get into Story 2. Story 2, June 15th, 2009, Ontario, Canada. It was early morning in Ontario, a Monday. The sky was still cool, the light soft over the quiet streets where Hattis Trowbridge Oglu lived with her family. She was 30 years old, wide awake, and packing the last of her things into a small suitcase. Today, she was leaving for New York. She kissed her father goodbye, told her family she loved them, and promised to call soon. She looked hopeful, excited even, and perhaps in her heart, she believed that this trip would change her life forever. They believed it too. Hattis came from a proud Turkish family. She had immigrated to Canada with her parents and relatives when she was just 15 years old. Her childhood in Turkey had been close-knit and traditional, filled with family gatherings, old customs, and quiet obedience. When they all boarded the plane to Canada together, her family had been filled with hope. Hope for freedom, opportunity, and a new kind of future. They found a home in Toronto, where a large Turkish community already existed. It gave them a sense of belonging and cultural comfort. Still, the challenges of building a new life in a foreign country were steep, especially for Hattis. She was brave, she worked hard, she followed the expectations placed on her, but there was something in her that longed for independence. After high school, her father arranged her first marriage. She barely knew the man. They were never left alone, never allowed to get close before the wedding. The marriage fell apart quickly. Then came a second arranged match. That one failed too. Now at 30, Hattis had already been divorced twice, something considered deeply shameful in many conservative Turkish families. But instead of shrinking under the weight of that judgment, she stood taller. She had become her own woman. She worked 2 jobs, one as a forklift operator at a rubber company during the night, and another part-time shift at a bakery during the day. Her schedule was brutal, but she never complained. She had her own money, her own voice, and the love and admiration of her family. Despite the failed marriages, Hattis's father saw her strength. He gave her something rare, the permission to choose her own future husband. This time she would decide, and she believed she had found the one. His name was Raza Kosa. He lived in New York City and worked as a welder. They had never met in person, but a close friend of Hattis's had introduced them, saying they'd be perfect for each other. After a few exchanged numbers, calls turned into conversations, and conversations became daily habits. They texted, emailed, talked for hours at a time. By all accounts, Raza was polite, attentive, charming. He spoke Turkish fluently, understood the culture, and seemed genuinely interested in Hattis's world. After weeks of building a connection across the border, they agreed to meet. But Hattis didn't want to travel alone, not to New York, and not to meet a man for the first time. So she brought a close friend with her. Together, they made a weekend out of it. It felt like a fairy tale. Raza took time off work to show them around Manhattan. He was kind, generous, and respectful. He told Hattis he had a house in Hicksville, Long Island, and though he returned there every night, he always made time for them in the city. Hattis's friend said she'd never seen her glow like that before. She returned home full of stories, her heart buzzing with hope. Over the next 6 months, Hattis visited Raza multiple times. Each time, she told her father she was going to see him. Out of respect for her family and tradition, she booked her own hotel room on every trip. Sometimes Raza would stay with her, but most nights he returned to his home in Long Island. They made plans, big ones: marriage, children, a new life. The arrangement, as she told her family, was that once they were married, Raza would move to Toronto to be close to her relatives, since his own family still lived in Turkey. Hattis's family liked what they saw. They believed she'd finally found happiness. But before anything could be finalized, one final test remained. She had to meet Raza's family. That trip to Turkey was arranged for June. Haddis would drive to New York first, then fly to Turkey from there with Raza. Her bags were packed. Her mind was made up. She was going to see the country of her childhood again. And maybe, just maybe, she'd come back as someone's wife. No one could have known then that she would never return. Haddis's family stood in the driveway, waving goodbye as her car disappeared around the corner. It was June 15th, 2009. She had promised to call them once she reached New York. Her father had hugged her tightly before she left, told her to enjoy the trip, and assured her that her late mother would have been proud. But then, silence. 2 days passed, then 3. No call, no message. At first they told themselves she must have landed safely. Maybe she was busy sightseeing or spending time with Raza's family. After all, it had been 15 years since she left Turkey. This trip was meaningful. Maybe she was soaking in every moment. And besides, international calls were expensive, complicated, especially back in 2009. Still, the unease began to creep in. On the 5th day, Hatis's father finally picked up the phone. He called her. She didn't answer. He tried again. Nothing. Then came a call from Raza Kosa. His voice was calm. His words were gentle. But what he said didn't make sense. Haddis, he explained, had gone to Turkey alone. He said that while they were at the airport, he ran into trouble with his immigration paperwork. If he left the U.S., he told her, he wouldn't be allowed back in. So she insisted on going ahead without him. She wanted to meet his family, and she didn't want to cancel the trip. So she boarded the plane by herself. Hatis's father was stunned. It didn't sound like something his daughter would do. She had never been to Turkey alone in her adult life. And yet, Raza spoke with confidence, assuring him that everything was fine. "She's happy," he said. "She's with my family. She's enjoying herself." Haddis's father asked him to pass along a message. "Tell her I love her. Tell her to call us soon." That call came on June 29th. Then, for a full month, nothing. No contact, no word, just quiet. Then, on July 31st, Raza called again. But this time, his story had changed completely. He told Hatis's father that she hadn't gone to Turkey after all. She had returned. And when she did, something was different. "She changed her mind about everything," Raza said. "She told me she didn't want to get married. We got into an argument outside the airport. Then she drove off. I had to walk home." The change in tone was jarring. The story no longer made sense. How could she have returned, walked away from the relationship, and never once contacted her family? Her father's heart dropped. He didn't know what to believe. He gathered the rest of the family. He repeated everything Raza had said. First, that she went to Turkey alone. Now that she came back and left him. It didn't add up. Not to anyone. They knew her. She would never vanish like this. For 2 weeks they tried everything. They called her phone dozens of times a day. Left messages. Prayed she'd pick up. Nothing ever came. And so, on August 13th, 2009, 2 months after she had driven off from their Ontario home, they walked into the Toronto Police Department and filed a missing persons report. The officers listened carefully. They took notes, asked questions, and promised to investigate. But they also knew this case would be difficult. Too much time had passed. The trail was already cold. The first step was to track Hatis's movements after she left Ontario. They knew she had driven to New York. That was the last anyone had heard from her. So detectives from Toronto coordinated with the New York Police Department. They needed every possible address associated with Raza Kosa. With NYPD officers at their side, they began knocking on doors. One by one, each location came up empty. No Haddis, no Raza. He had vanished too. In Long Island, at the house Raza claimed as his own, they found something troubling, a sticker on the door. It marked the property as vacant. Mortgage payments had stopped 3 months earlier. Raza hadn't lived there for weeks. Haddis's father flew to New York himself. He brought missing persons flyers and walked the streets with them in hand. He visited the Turkish embassy, desperate for answers. There, he learned something shocking. On June 18th, just 3 days after leaving Ontario, Haddis had visited the Turkish embassy in New York. She was alive then, and she had come to change her passport information, updating it so she could travel to Turkey. Staff confirmed it. She was preparing to fly out of JFK Airport just 3 days later. On June 21st, it matched the timeline. But something was wrong. There was no record she ever arrived in Turkey. Turkish authorities said she never entered the country. Canadian border records showed she never returned. So where was she? Did she ever get on the plane? To find out, detectives requested the flight manifest for the Turkish Airlines flight scheduled for that day. But post 9/11 regulations made the process difficult. It took time, and in a case like this, every day mattered. While they waited, investigators searched surveillance footage from JFK Airport, and there, they made a discovery. CCTV showed Hatis's car entering the airport parking garage just 45 minutes before her flight was due to take off. The car remained parked for over an hour, then left. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify who was inside, but the movements suggested someone had been dropped off. It supported Raza's original version of events, but still. Haddis had never arrived in Turkey. Her name was not on the list of passengers, and by the time investigators reviewed the airport's internal footage, it was too late. JFK only stored footage for 30 days. The airport interior video, potential proof of whether she boarded the plane, had already been deleted. The last time anyone could prove Hatis was alive was June 18th. Everything after that was based on Raza's word, and now Raza Kosa was nowhere to be found. As the days passed with no new sign of Hatis, Toronto detectives kept pressing forward. They believed now, more than ever, that something had happened to her in New York. But what they didn't expect was what they were about to discover next. It started with a parking ticket. On September 1st, 2009, New York investigators found a car registered to Raza Kosa. That car had received a violation on July 29th, just a few blocks from a Manhattan address, 3159 3rd Avenue. Police followed the lead and discovered something chilling. That address? It was a job site. Raza had been working there at the time, welding as part of a contract job. But then came the second shock. While running Kosa's background, detectives uncovered a piece of information no one had seen coming. He was married. His wife's name was Winsome Perez, and she too was missing. According to records, 46-year-old Winsome had not shown up to work at her job with Chase Bank on July 29th. The same day, Raza's car was ticketed near the Manhattan job site. Her family had reported her missing shortly afterward. No one had heard from her since. Two women, connected to the same man, missing within weeks of each other. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Toronto police immediately reached out to their counterparts in New York. They told them everything about Hatis, about the disappearance, about Raza's strange behavior. Now, both departments were investigating the same man. But there was one massive difference. The United States had an international treaty with Turkey. Canada didn't. If Raza had fled to Turkey, New York had the legal authority to pursue him. Yet they hadn't. And the trail was getting colder by the day. When the news reached Winsome's family, they were stunned. None of them had ever heard of Hatis. They didn't know Raza had been living a second life. He had never once given any indication that he was seeing another woman, let alone planning to marry one. They thought he had been a faithful husband. Now, he was gone. His house in Hicksville had been repossessed. The doors were marked with vacancy notices. No one had lived there in months. Investigators knew that Raza had boarded a plane to Turkey the day after Winsome was reported missing. He hadn't returned. This raised the most urgent question of all. Had Raza killed them both? The timing couldn't be a coincidence. On July 28th, Winsome was last seen alive. On July 29th, Raza's car was parked outside the job site. On July 30th, he was on a flight out of the country. One woman was missing in June. Another vanished in July. And now, the man connecting them both was across the world. Toronto detectives desperately needed to reach him, but without an international treaty, they couldn't force cooperation from Turkey. So they tried something else. They turned to a fellow officer, one of Turkish descent. He spoke the language, understood the culture, and they hoped this would encourage Raza to open up. Surprisingly, it worked. The detective called Raza directly, using a number provided by Winsom's family. Raza answered. Over several conversations, he spoke freely about Hatis. He described himself as a man deeply hurt by what had happened. He claimed that after they returned from Turkey, things changed. He said Hatis had been texting another man. According to Raza, he became jealous. He confronted her, took her phone, read the messages. She betrayed me, he told the detective. You know what that means in our culture. The detective remained calm. He didn't challenge him, only asked questions. He let Raza talk. Raza said he had been sent into darkness. He cried on the phone, claimed his heart had been broken, said Hatis left him. I didn't hurt her, he said. I loved her to death. But it was the way he said it, past tense, loved. The detective pressed him gently. What did you do to her? Raza didn't answer. Did you kill her? The detective asked. No, Raza replied quietly. I didn't kill her. Yet the conversations left detectives uneasy. His words hinted at guilt. His tone suggested pain, but not innocence. And through it all, Raza never mentioned Winsome Perez, not once. He never acknowledged that he had a wife. While Raza Kosa continued to speak with the Turkish-speaking detective, revealing just enough to raise concern but never enough to confess, more revelations surfaced. This time, from someone close to Hatis. Her friend, the same woman who had first introduced her to Raza, came forward to Toronto police. Until then, she had remained silent, unsure of whether to share something Hatis had confided in her. But now, with Raza missing and his wife also unaccounted for, she felt compelled. She told detectives that during one of Hatis's trips to New York, something disturbing had happened. The couple had gotten into a fight. Raza had accused Hatis of talking to another man over a simple text about work scheduling. His jealousy, she said, turned violent. He tied Hatis's hands behind her back with a belt. He put a bag over her head, and then for hours he screamed at her, slammed the mattress beside her, accused her of betraying him. Hatis had feared he would hit her, or worse. But eventually he untied her, removed the bag, let her go. She didn't report it. Instead, she told her friend and asked her not to tell anyone. Raza had told her afterward that if she wanted to be with him, she needed to be more obedient. She needed to listen. She needed to do what she was told. Hatis's friend now saw the signs she hadn't before. The charm, the control, the rage under the surface. The police took her statement seriously. It aligned perfectly with the subtle confessions Raza had made during his phone calls. He had admitted to being possessive. He said he had always hated how much Hatis talked to other men. He even told the detective, "You're Turkish, you understand. What would you do if she shamed you?" And yet, he never admitted to harming her. Still, the more he spoke, the more it became clear. Raza had something to hide. Back in New York, investigators working Winsome Perez's case were making slow progress. She hadn't left behind any clues. Her car remained parked. Her phone was off. Her job at Chase had reported her missing after she failed to show up with no call. It was completely out of character. The only major clue was that parking ticket issued to Raza's vehicle parked outside the Manhattan job site on the same day Winsome vanished. That address, 3159 3rd Avenue, was a location where Raza had been working as a welder. Yet even with this information, Winsome's disappearance never made the news. There were no public alerts, no media coverage, no photo broadcasts. Even more surprisingly, police withheld a critical detail: that Winsome Perez was married to Raza Cosa, the man wanted for questioning in Hatis's disappearance. It remained a quiet case. Then, after nearly a year, something changed. Workers at a company called Express Steel, where Raza had once been contracted, noticed a terrible smell coming from behind a storage container on the property. A black plastic bag had been wedged between a 40-foot steel bin and a chain link fence. It was sealed tightly. The odor was unmistakable. At first, employees assumed it was a dead animal. In New York City, it wasn't uncommon for people to dispose of pets that way. But as the smell worsened, they called the police. Officers arrived. The bag was open. Inside were the remains of a human body. The decomposition was advanced. The wrapping was thick. It had been hidden for months, but dental records later confirmed what investigators feared. It was Winsome Perez. With Winsome's body discovered, the case finally began to attract attention. But once again, police were tight-lipped. They didn't release her connection to Raza Cosa. They didn't tell the public she was married to a man already connected to a different missing woman. And even as this critical discovery was made, Hatis's disappearance still had no resolution. One by one, the failures piled up. When investigators returned to JFK Airport, they made another infuriating discovery. Hatis's car had been there the entire time, parked in the airport garage for over a year. But no one had noticed. Why? Because it had been misclassified. Instead of logging her Ontario license plate under the correct Canadian province code, ONT, an airport employee had mistakenly tagged it as CA, California. So when authorities had searched for her car, it hadn't come up. When they opened the vehicle, they found signs of activity. Old McDonald's cups, trash, clothing, and a shoebox for men's Skechers sneakers. In the trunk, they found something else: cleaning supplies, and traces of blood. The windows had been broken, likely by vandals or thieves. Common in airport garages after long-term parking goes unnoticed. But despite the blood evidence, New York police didn't test it. They claimed it wouldn't offer relevant evidence. To Toronto detectives, this was beyond frustrating. They believed Hatis had never left the country. She had entered the U.S. and vanished. Now, her car was found with blood in it. Her suspected abuser had fled the country. And a second woman, his legal wife, had been found dead. But the blood was never analyzed. The signs were there, yet no one acted. With the discovery of Winsome Perez's body, the evidence now pointed squarely at Raza Cosa. Two women, both closely tied to him, had vanished. One was confirmed dead. The other, Hatis, was still missing. Now, New York authorities were finally ready to act. They contacted the Turkish government and requested assistance. For the first time, they declared that they would officially charge Raza Cosa with murder in the death of Winsome Perez. With this charge, they could move forward with extradition. The manhunt began. Only a few days passed before the search came to a sudden, unexpected halt. Raza Cosa was found dead in Turkey. Officials reported that he had jumped to his death from a building in the city of Sivas, his hometown. He left behind a suicide note. One line from that letter stood out: "My biggest mistake was falling in love with a Canadian woman." It was the only reference to Hatis. To the public, it sounded like a confession. But to Hatis's family, it felt like a door slamming shut, with every answer locked behind it. No confession, no location, no closure. They weren't just grieving the man who might have harmed their daughter. They were grieving the death of truth itself. Because without Raza alive, there would be no trial. And without a trial, there would be no more investigation. But something about Raza's death didn't feel right. Only his relatives were allowed to view the body. No DNA test was ever confirmed. No fingerprinting, just a photograph taken from above as he lay on a stretcher outside the ambulance. Hatis's family looked at that photo. They stared at it closely, and they said, That's not him. The man's face didn't match the images they had seen of Raza. The resemblance was loose at best, and with no independent confirmation, they began to suspect what seemed unthinkable: that Raza Koza had faked his death. One detail stood out even more: the shoes. When Raza's body was found, he was wearing Skechers sneakers. Same size, same color, same brand as the shoebox found in Hatis's abandoned car at JFK. To some, that confirmed it was him, but to her family, it raised more doubts. What if the shoes had been planted? What if the whole thing was part of a plan to disappear permanently and shut down both cases? They pleaded for a DNA test. They asked for independent confirmation. The request was denied. Instead, authorities closed Winsom's case, declared Raza dead, and with no body and no confession, Hattis's case remained open, but frozen. No movement, no momentum, no progress. She was still officially listed as missing. But everyone knew the truth. Years passed and nothing changed. There were no new sightings, no discoveries, no breakthroughs. The blood found in Hattis's car? Never tested. The statements from Raza's phone calls? Not enough to pursue charges. The flight manifest confirmed she had never boarded the plane to Turkey. The parking ticket from Raza's car proved he was near the job site the same day his wife vanished. And the only man who could tie it all together? Gone. With the treaty between Canada and Turkey non-existent, Toronto investigators were blocked at every turn. They couldn't access Raza's records, couldn't trace his last movements, couldn't even fully verify if he was truly dead. And the U.S., which did have that treaty, had closed its case. Winsom's death was no longer under investigation. Without shared information, Hatis's case sat cold, caught in a jurisdictional limbo. Her family remained vocal. They spoke to news outlets, shared photos, told their story. But as time passed, public interest faded. The case was no longer in the headlines. It became another name on a list. Still, they refused to let her be forgotten. 10 years later, June 2019, Toronto police released every piece of information they had. The goal was to reignite the case, spark a new lead, or reach someone who might know the truth. They published the full timeline, shared what had been learned, explained the connection between Hatis and Winsom, described Raza's background, his sudden departure, his death in Turkey, the suicide note, the Skechers. But no tips came in. Hattis Trowbridge Oglu was still gone. No one knows if she died before her car ever left JFK, or if she was held somewhere for days. No one knows whether she ever spoke to Raza after June 18th. No one knows if she ever knew about Winsom. All that's left are questions. Did she find out he was married? Did Winsom find out about Hatis? Did he panic? Did he plan it? And if that man who fell from the building wasn't Raza, where is he now? Hattis's father still believes she was brave, that she tried to choose her own life, that she made decisions with her heart. But that one choice, trusting a man she barely knew, may have cost her everything. The case remains open, but without Raza, without a confession, and without a body, the silence is all that's left. If this case affected you, or made you think about how society treats its most vulnerable, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Not for the views, but because the more we remember these names, the less likely they are to be erased. Another case drops tomorrow. Until then, thanks for watching, stay safe, and take care of each other.